The air in the royal palace of Arthia was thick with silence, an unnatural stillness that settled over the darkened halls like a suffocating shroud. Dr. Eric Myers had been to many worlds, treated patients of all species, and faced diseases that defied logic, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the quiet horror of what lay ahead. His footsteps echoed as he followed a silent attendant through the cold marble corridors. The palace, once a place of grandeur, felt more like a mausoleum. Tapestries of Arthian victories hung untouched, their colors faded. Statues of past rulers stood in the dim glow of bioluminescent lanterns, their expressions frozen in regal indifference. It was a kingdom built on power, a kingdom that had turned its back on its queen. Eric had heard the rumors long before he arrived. Queen Veya, the once beloved ruler of Arthia, had been struck by an illness the people did not understand. What had started as whispers of concern had twisted into superstition, and from there into exile. The court saw her condition as a divine punishment, a mark of weakness. Even her own husband, King Raylor, had abandoned her, choosing to preserve his rule rather than stand beside his wife. Eric tightened his grip on his medical bag. He had seen neglect before, but this was something worse. This was a deliberate erasure. The attendant leading him stopped before a pair of enormous doors, their once gilded surface dulled by time. No guards stood watch. No servants lingered nearby. It was as if this part of the palace had been forgotten. Without a word, the attendant pushed open the heavy doors. A rush of stale air greeted Eric as he stepped inside. The chamber was vast, but barren, stripped of all the luxuries a queen should have. The furniture was covered in dust, the curtains drawn tight to block out the sky. And in the center of it all, on a bed that looked more like an altar of abandonment, lay the woman he had come to save. Queen Veya. She was barely more than a shadow of herself, her once radiant silver skin now marred by glowing fractures of sickly blue veins that pulsed beneath the surface. Her hair, once woven with jeweled chains, fell in tangled strands over the pillow. The gown she wore hung loosely on her frame, as if she had wasted away beneath its weight. Eric took a slow breath, pushing aside the anger that coiled in his chest. He had seen dying patients before, had fought to save lives that others had given up on. But this was more than illness. This was cruelty. He stepped forward, his voice firm yet careful. "Your Majesty?" For a moment there was no response. Then slowly she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time Eric saw them. The queen's eyes, once legendary in their brilliance, now dulled by pain and exhaustion. They locked onto him, hazy with confusion, flickering with something distant. "You're not supposed to be here," she murmured, her voice fragile, as if it had not been used in years. Eric lowered himself to one knee beside the bed, scanning her face for recognition, for some sign that she was still present. "I was summoned," he said, though he doubted she had been the one to call for him. "I'm here to help you." A faint breath of laughter escaped her lips, bitter and weak. "Help?" she whispered. "There is no help for me." Eric met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "That's not true." Veya watched him for a long moment, studying him, as if trying to determine whether he was real or just another cruel trick of fate. Then, as if exhausted by the effort, her eyes closed again. Eric exhaled, pulling out his medical scanner. "Let's find out." And with that, he began his work. The scanner emitted a soft hum as Eric moved it over Veya's fragile frame, reading the data that scrolled across his visor. The results were damning. Her body was in a state of constant attack, her immune system consuming her from the inside out. Her energy reserves were dangerously low, her vitals weak, but not beyond saving. He reached for a vial of stabilizing serum, loading it into an injector. The treatment wouldn't cure her, not yet, but it would halt the worst of the symptoms, allow her body to regain some of its strength. As he pressed the injector against her arm, Veya flinched, her body instinctively recoiling. "It's all right," Eric said softly. "This will help." Her breathing was uneven, but she did not resist further. The injector hissed as it released the serum into her bloodstream. Within seconds, her trembling lessened, her muscles relaxing slightly. Eric sat back, observing her, waiting. The room was deathly silent, save for the slow, rhythmic beeping of his portable monitor. Then finally she spoke again. "You shouldn't waste your time." Eric lifted his gaze. "That's not your decision. Vela's lips barely curved in something that might have been a smile if it weren't so filled with sorrow. "And you are?" "A doctor," he replied simply. "And you're my patient now." She exhaled, the sound barely more than a whisper. "You're a fool." Eric smirked. "I've been called worse." She opened her eyes again, studying him more closely now. "Why are you here?" "Because someone finally realized that abandoning a sick queen doesn't make the problem disappear." Her gaze flickered with something sharp, anger, pain, maybe even shame. "My illness is a stain on the throne," she murmured. "My husband, he did what he thought was best." Eric scoffed. "He let you rot in a forgotten room." Veya closed her eyes, exhaustion settling over her features. "He was afraid." "Of what?" Eric challenged. "That your sickness would tarnish his image? That his people would see him as weak for standing by his own wife?" Silence. That was answer enough. Eric let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't care about your husband or his fears or his throne. I care about you, and whether you believe it or not, I can help you." Veya didn't respond right away, but there was something different in her expression now. A shift so subtle that Eric almost missed it. Not trust, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, a sliver of hope. She closed her eyes again, exhaling softly. "Then do what you must, Doctor." Eric nodded, adjusting the settings on his scanner. "Rest now, Your Majesty. You're not going to die today." And for the first time in a long, long time, someone was fighting for her. Eric remained by Veya's side as the serum coursed through her veins, stabilizing the worst of her symptoms. He watched as her breathing deepened, her muscles slowly uncoiling from years of pain-induced tension. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give him a foothold in what would be a long battle. He glanced around the chamber again, disgust curling in his gut. This was no place for a queen. The grand, polished walls of the palace had been stripped of warmth here, leaving only a hollow, forgotten prison. The heavy drapes that smothered the windows kept the world outside from ever reaching her, isolating her in both mind and body. How had it come to this? How had an entire kingdom, her own husband, allowed this to happen? A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. The same attendant who had led him here entered hesitantly, his gaze flicking toward Veya's still form before settling on Eric. His posture was rigid, his expression carefully neutral. But Eric could see it, the discomfort, the guilt lurking just beneath the surface. "She is stable," Eric said, watching the man's reaction carefully. "But she should have been treated long before now." The attendant hesitated, shifting on his feet. "The king decreed that she was to remain here, undisturbed." Eric scoffed, his fingers tightening around his medical scanner. "Undisturbed?" he echoed. "That's a polite way of saying left to die." The attendant flinched. Eric took a step forward, his voice dropping to something colder, more pointed. "How long has she been like this?" The man exhaled through his nose, reluctant to speak. 3 years. Eric's jaw clenched. 3 years of wasting away in solitude. 3 years of sickness left unchecked, 3 years of suffering while the king paraded himself as the ruler of a thriving empire, 3 years of silence. "That's long enough," Eric said firmly. The attendant swallowed. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to fix this." He turned back to Veya, her face still drawn but no longer as hollow, her body slowly adjusting to the first proper treatment she had likely ever received. He wasn't going to let her slip away. Not when she had already been abandoned once. He placed a hand on her wrist, checking her pulse. Stronger than before. That was good. She was fighting, and he would fight for her. The grand halls of the palace were nothing like the room where Veya had been kept, where her prison had been barren and cold. The rest of the castle gleamed with wealth. Golden pillars lined the corridors, intricate mosaics adorned the floors, and servants bustled about, their movements rehearsed and efficient. This was the image the king wanted his people to see. Power, prestige, an unshakable throne. Eric hated it. Every step he took through these halls fueled his anger. The guards at the throne room doors hesitated when he approached, their hands twitching toward their weapons. He wasn't surprised. He was an outsider, an anomaly in their world, a human doctor who had dared to tread where no one else would. But he didn't slow. He walked past them, through the towering doors, into the chamber where King Raylor sat in all his supposed glory. The throne room was vast, its ceilings impossibly high, chandeliers casting light across the polished marble. At the far end of the room, Raylor sat atop an obsidian throne, his expression unreadable, his golden robes draped over his imposing frame. For all his power, for all his grandeur, he was a coward. Eric had seen men like him before, rulers who cared more about perception than the lives beneath them. Raylor barely acknowledged him at first, instead sipping from a delicate glut as if the intrusion was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, he set the goblet down and leveled his gaze at Eric. "You are bolder than I expected," he mused. "Few dare to enter my hall unannounced." Eric didn't bow, didn't offer him the respect he did not deserve. "I came to speak about your wife," he said, his voice steady. Raylor raised a brow as if only now remembering that he had a wife. "Ah, so the doctor thinks he understands my affairs." Eric's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I understand more than you think." A flicker of amusement crossed Raylor's face, as if this was all some trivial game. "Do you?" "I understand that she was abandoned," Eric snapped, his patience wearing thin. "That she was locked away and left to rot while you paraded yourself before your people. I understand that her disease is treatable, that she could have lived a full life if you hadn't thrown her away like an inconvenience." Raylor's amusement faded. His golden eyes hardened, and for the first time Eric saw it, the fear lurking beneath the arrogance. "I did what was necessary," the king said coldly. Eric took a step forward. "You did what was cowardly." The room fell into stunned silence. The guards stiffened, glancing at one another, unsure whether to intervene. But Raylor didn't call for them. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the arms of his throne. "And what human do you intend to do about it?" Eric met his gaze without hesitation. "I intend to save her." Raylor let out a sharp breath of laughter. "You think I would allow such a thing?" "You don't have a choice," Eric shot back. "She's already responding to treatment. If you had any honor left, you'd let her live." Raylor's lips curled in something that was almost a sneer. "You speak to me of honor?" Eric didn't back down. "Yes, because you lost yours the day you turned your back on her." Raylor's hands clenched against the throne's arms, and for a moment Eric thought he would order the guards to seize him. But the king only exhaled slowly, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned back, his expression unreadable once more. "If she lives," he said finally, "she will never rule beside me again." Eric had expected that, had known that even if Veya survived, she would never be welcomed back in the way she deserved. But he also knew that she was stronger than this man, stronger than the chains that had bound her. "She doesn't need you," Eric said simply. He turned without waiting for permission to leave, walking away from the throne with his head held high. The guards didn't stop him. The servants looked away, avoiding his gaze. "And Raylor?" He said nothing, because deep down he knew the truth. He had already lost. The journey back to Veya's chamber was long, not because of distance, but because of the weight in Eric's chest. He had faced men like Raylor before, rulers who believed their power was absolute, who saw people as tools, burdens, or symbols of their own greatness rather than as living, breathing souls. And yet, something about the way Raylor had spoken of Veya made Eric's blood run cold. She had been his wife, his queen, and he had spoken of her like discarded waste. Eric clenched his fists as he stepped into the cold chamber where she lay. He had just confronted the most powerful man in the kingdom, yet standing here before Veya, the true weight of what he was doing settled upon him. He had come here to be a healer, to mend what was broken. But this wasn't just about medicine anymore. This was about justice. Veya stirred as he approached, her glowing eyes fluttering open. The serum was working faster than he had anticipated. Her breathing was stronger, her color returning, the fevered sheen of exhaustion beginning to fade. When she saw him, she studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You look angry," she murmured. Eric exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I spoke to your husband." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. "And?" "He doesn't deserve to rule," Eric said, unable to keep the frustration from his voice. "He doesn't deserve you." Veya let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I know that." She shifted, pushing herself up slightly, though the movement still took effort. "But knowing it does not change my reality." Eric knelt beside her, adjusting the blanket over her frail frame. Your reality is changing, he said firmly. You're getting stronger, and when you are, I need you to make a choice. She blinked at him. A choice? Yes, he said. Do you want to stay here? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Veya stared past him, her gaze unfocused. Where else would I go? Anywhere, Eric said. You could leave, start over. You don't owe this kingdom anything. A long silence followed. Then she looked at him, truly looked at him. And what would you do? Eric hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had come to heal a dying queen, not to get entangled in a political nightmare, not to. He met her gaze and suddenly realized what she was really asking. She wasn't just asking if she could leave. She was asking if he would leave her. Something inside him shifted, and without thinking, he reached out, taking her hand in his. Her skin was no longer as cold as before. I go where you go, he said. And that was the moment he saw it, the first real flicker of something beyond suffering in her expression. Hope. The wind howled outside the palace, sweeping through the empty corridors of the eastern wing, rattling the windows like whispers of ghosts long forgotten. The palace was asleep, the great halls dimly lit, the courtiers and nobles resting in their beds without a care for the queen locked away within their walls. But tonight, things would change. Veya sat up for the first time in years, her hands trembling as she braced herself against the mattress. The serum had worked wonders. Her strength was returning, her mind was clearing. But with clarity came realization, and with realization came rage. She had wasted away in this place, abandoned like a forgotten relic. She had accepted it once, had resigned herself to the idea that her sickness had made her unworthy. But now she knew the truth. She had been cast aside, not because she was weak, but because Raylor had feared her strength, and Eric had given it back to her. She turned to where he stood near the window, his arms crossed as he watched the city lights below. He was tense, waiting for something. You said I had a choice, she said softly. Eric turned, his expression unreadable. You do. Veya took a slow breath. Then I choose to leave. Something eased in his stance, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for her to say it. He nodded once. Then we leave tonight. The plan had been forming in his mind since he first laid eyes on her. The palace guards were loyal to the king, but they would not be expecting anyone to remove the queen. To them, she was nothing more than a fading secret, a ghost of a woman tucked away behind locked doors. They would not be prepared for her to rise from the dead. Eric moved quickly, helping her to her feet. Her legs were weak, but they held. Barely. We take the servants' passage, he said, steadying her. It leads to the lower docking bay where my ship is stored. No one will question me leaving, and they won't be looking for you. Veya nodded, her grip tightening on his arm. Then let's go. They moved through the corridors like shadows, avoiding the paths where guards patrolled. The palace was a vast maze of luxury, its towering walls gilded in wealth, but none of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered. Veya clenched her jaw as they slipped past an open chamber. Raylor's personal quarters. She saw the remnants of his lavish evening, the half-finished goblet of wine, the luxurious silk draped over the ornate furniture. He slept soundly in the next room, unaware that the woman he had discarded was walking freely through his halls. A part of her wanted to wake him, to let him see her, standing on her own, defying everything he had sentenced her to. But no, she would not waste another second of her life on him. They moved on, descending the spiral steps into the lower levels of the palace. Eric was careful, scanning the halls, ensuring their path remained undetected. Finally, they reached the docking bay. Eric's ship was small but reliable, a sleek vessel designed for travel across the most dangerous sectors. The entrance was only meters away. They had done it. Then, a voice rang out. Halt! Guards. 3 of them. Standing at the entrance, weapons drawn, Veya's heart pounded. They had been seen. Eric moved before she could react, stepping between her and the guards, his expression unreadable. I have authorization to leave, he said calmly. The lead guard sneered. Not with her. Veya straightened. She wasn't the same fragile woman they had locked away. I am your queen, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The guards hesitated. But then, she is no queen. The voice was familiar. Raylor. He stood at the far end of the corridor, flanked by more guards, his golden eyes burning with anger. "I told you," he said, his voice laced with venom. "She will never leave this place." Violet's fingers curled into fists. She had made her choice, and she would fight for it. She turned to Eric, meeting his gaze. "We do this my way." Eric smirked, his hands moving toward his concealed weapon. "I was hoping you'd say that." The night was not over, and neither was the Queen's reign. The docking bay was no longer silent. The air thrummed with tension as the guards, weapons drawn, formed a blockade between them and the ship. Behind them, King Raylor stood tall, his golden robes flowing as he strode forward, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Veya had expected anger, had expected threats, but what she had not expected was the fear lurking behind his eyes. He hadn't thought she would survive. He hadn't believed she would ever stand before him again. For years, he had convinced himself that she would waste away, that time would do what he had not dared to do himself, erase her existence. And now she was here. Not as a whisper of the past, not as a secret buried beneath the weight of shame, but standing, alive, and with fire burning in her veins. "I gave you everything," Raylor said, his voice a dangerous hush. "A place among the stars, a crown, and this is how you repay me?" Veya met his gaze unflinchingly. "You didn't give me a thing," she said, her voice steady. "You took." The guards hesitated at her words. Some of them had been at the palace since before her illness, had once sworn loyalty to both their king and queen. But they had obeyed Raylor's decree, had stood by as she was locked away, and now, as they faced her, the guilt was plain on their faces. She could use that. Veya took a step forward, ignoring the burning in her legs. She had spent years lying in that wretched bed, her body wasting away, her voice ignored. She would not be weak now. "You all know me," she said, her gaze sweeping over the soldiers. "You knew me before I fell ill, and yet you stood by and watched as I was cast aside, as if I were something to be forgotten." The lead guard shifted, discomfort flashing in his eyes. "I am still your queen," Veya continued, her voice rising. "I lived, despite everything he did to me. And now, I choose to live on my own terms." The words hung in the air. The guards glanced at one another, uncertainty creeping into their ranks. Raylor saw it, and his temper flared. "She is no queen of mine," he snarled. "Stand down and let her die a traitor." No one moved. And then, a single guard lowered his weapon. Then another. Veya felt her breath catch in her throat. Raylor's face darkened. "You dare disobey me?" But the hesitation had already shattered his hold on them. Eric took the opportunity, his hand hovering over his sidearm, whispering, "We need to move. Now." Veya nodded. They had swayed the guards, but Raylor himself would not let this end without a fight. And she was ready. Raylor's eyes flickered with rage as he realized his command had gone unanswered. He had ruled with fear for so long, had maintained absolute control, but tonight, his grip had slipped. His hand shot out, summoning energy to his palm. A pulse of raw, crackling power, a gift of his royal bloodline. He had never needed brute force before. His words had always been enough. But now, as his carefully built empire trembled beneath him, he would not allow his wife to simply walk away. Eric moved first. In a flash, he unholstered his weapon, firing a shot directly at Raylor's outstretched hand. The plasma round collided with the forming energy, disrupting it with a sharp, electric crackle. The air smelled of ozone as the blast scattered into harmless sparks. Raylor snarled, stepping back, his fingers flexing as he prepared another strike. "You dare raise a weapon against me?" Eric didn't flinch. "Yeah," he said flatly. "I do." Veya used the distraction. She surged forward, her body screaming in protest, but she did not stop. She reached for the nearest guard's sheathed dagger, and the moment her fingers wrapped around the hilt, she felt something deep within her shift. She had always been the queen who spoke, the queen who ruled through wisdom, who relied on words over steel. But that part of her had been left in that darkened chamber, locked away alongside her sickness. This version of her was reborn in fire. She moved swiftly, closing the space between her and Raylor before he could react. With a single, decisive movement, she slashed across his chest, not deep enough to kill, but enough to leave a mark. Enough to make a statement. Raylor stumbled back, his golden robes stained with crimson. His expression was no longer just anger. It was shock. For the first time, he was looking at her not as something weak, not as something pathetic or unworthy. He was looking at her as a threat. Veya leveled the dagger at him, her breathing ragged. You do not own me. Raylor clutched his wound, his jaw clenched. He could still fight. He could still win. But when he looked around, he saw what Veya had already realized. The guards had stepped away. The court had fallen silent. His kingdom had already chosen. His power was crumbling beneath him. You are making a mistake, Raylor growled. Veya tilted her head slightly. No, she said softly. I'm correcting one. Eric was already at her side, his hand gently guiding her back toward the ship. They didn't need to kill Raylor. That wasn't her goal. Her goal was to leave. And this time, nothing would stop her. They stepped onto the docking ramp, the ship's engines already humming. The bay doors opened wide, revealing the endless stretch of space beyond. As Veya turned one last time, she met Raylor's gaze. He was still standing there, breathing hard, watching her with something unreadable in his eyes. He had lost. And he knew it. Without another word, Veya stepped onto the ship. The hatch sealed behind them. Eric moved quickly, guiding her to the co-pilot's seat as the ship lifted off, breaking free of the palace, of the city, of the world that had sought to cage her. She exhaled, watching as Arthia shrank in the viewport. Eric glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. So, he said, what now? Veya turned to him, her violet eyes gleaming with something new. Now, she murmured. Then with certainty she said, we live. The hum of the ship's engines filled the quiet cabin, a constant rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through Veya's very bones. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her gaze fixed on the shrinking view of Arthia below them, its once imposing cities now reduced to distant lights against the darkness of space. She had never thought she would leave. Not like this, not on her terms. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or disbelief, she wasn't sure. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was wearing off, leaving behind a strange hollowness in its wake. She had done it. She had stood before Raylor, had fought, had chosen, and yet freedom did not feel the way she had expected it to. You're quiet. Eric's voice was soft, careful, as he adjusted the ship's trajectory. He was watching her, his gaze assessing but not intrusive. She had come to recognize it, the way he observed people, not just their words but their state, the way he paid attention to things others overlooked. Veya let out a slow breath, turning away from the viewport. I think I forgot what it feels like to have a choice. Eric nodded as if he understood, and maybe he did. It's a lot to process. She gave a hollow laugh. That's an understatement. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Eric leaned back in his chair, exhaling. You don't have to decide anything right now. We're not on a schedule. Veya tilted her head slightly, studying him. You say that like you plan to stay. He smirked. I say that because I do plan to stay. She searched his face for hesitation, for any sign that he was simply being polite, that he would drop her off at the nearest safe station and disappear. But there was none of that. There was only quiet certainty. Something tightened in her chest. Why? Eric didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his chair slightly, facing her fully. Because I didn't save you just to walk away. His words sent a ripple through her, something raw and unfamiliar. No one had ever chosen her before, not without conditions, not without expectations. She swallowed. You did save me. Eric's expression softened. No, he said quietly. You saved yourself. I was just there to make sure you didn't have to do it alone. Veya turned back to the stars, her chest rising and falling in measured breaths. She had spent so long being defined by what she couldn't do. Now, she had to figure out what she wanted to do. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She wasn't a queen anymore. So who was she? For the first time in years, she had no answer. And for the first time, she realized that was okay. The ship had settled into a quiet drift through the outskirts of the system, far from Arthia's reach. Veya sat in the lounge, her fingers tracing patterns against the metal table, her mind a tangle of thoughts. Eric sat across from her, watching her in that patient way of his. He hadn't pressed her to speak, hadn't demanded she decide what came next. But she needed to say it, needed to hear it for herself. I don't know what I want, she admitted finally. Eric nodded, as if he had expected this. That's okay. She exhaled sharply. Is it? He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. You've spent years in a cage, Veya. No one expects you to have all the answers right away. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening slightly. I don't know who I am outside of him, outside of that palace. Eric was silent for a moment before he said, "Then maybe it's time you find out." His words were simple, but they struck something deep within her. She had spent so long being defined by Raylor's neglect, by the illness that had nearly taken her, by the image of a queen she had never truly been allowed to be. Now, for the first time, she was free to be something else. She just had to decide what that was. Viola looked up at Eric, studying him, this human who had risked everything to save her. "And you?" she asked. "What about you? What do you want?" Eric tilted his head, considering her question. Then, with a small, lopsided grin, he said, "I think I want to see where this goes." Vela blinked. "Where what goes?" His smile didn't fade. "You, us, this." He gestured vaguely around them. "Whatever comes next." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "You don't even know where I'm going." Eric shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I'll go with you." She stared at him, searching his face, looking for any trace of deception. But there was none. Just honesty. No conditions. No expectations. Just choice. Vela let out a slow breath, something in her chest loosening. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where she would go or what she would become. But she did know this. She wasn't alone anymore. And for now, that was enough. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his, a silent acknowledgement, a beginning. "All right," she murmured. Eric grinned. "All right." The ship hummed softly around them as they drifted into the unknown. A new path, a new life, and this time it was theirs to choose.